Welcome. I'm Andy Carlson, and you're listening to the Time with Tim podcast. Each episode, we explore the impact of complex trauma through the personal journeys of our guests. Along the way, we'll connect with experts and individuals who share their unique perspectives, insights, and practical tools to help you on your healing journey. Let's take this time to learn together. Welcome to the Time with Tim podcast, where we explore the path to healing from complex trauma. I'm your host, Andy, and today I'm thrilled to welcome a very special guest. We have with us someone who has profoundly impacted the world of trauma recovery and addictions counseling, and whose work has transformed countless lives. He's the founder of Tim Fletcher Company, the creator of the REACT program, which stands for Recovery Education for Addictions and Complex Trauma, and a pastor with more than 30 years of experience. His groundbreaking teachings on complex trauma have reached audiences worldwide through his YouTube channel, seminars, and now through this podcast. Today, we're turning the tables, and I have the privilege of interviewing the man behind the message, Tim Fletcher himself. And Tim, welcome to your own Time with Tim podcast. It's an honor to have you as a guest today.
It's an honor to be here, Andy. Looking forward to it.
I'm excited to dive into both your journey and your worldview. And so I'm hoping to ask you about your upbringing, your relationships, your calling to be a pastor, and eventually diving into trauma and addictions counseling. But before we begin, I'd like to clear one thing up. So many people know you from your videos and teachings, and I've had dozens of clients say that they feel like you know them personally and have watched them grow up because your insights resonate so deeply with their life experiences. And so often when people find your videos, they end up binge watching them, whether it's on shame, codependence, narcissism, anger. And so, this kind of like intimate knowledge of others, this close relationship, it causes a lot of people to put you on a little bit of a pedestal and engage in some hero worship. So how does that feel for you as someone who describes himself as an introvert to know that you've become such a significant figure in the lives of so many people?
I guess I would feel honored. I think if I could back up and give a bigger answer to that question, Andy, it might be helpful. So I was a child that was very much aware of my internal world, thought deeply, but I also grew up in a home that was very much came from British immigrants. And so you didn't express emotions very much, but you talked about emotions. So you put words to emotions. You described what you were feeling instead of expressing it. And so I had a relationship with my mom that was a very secure attachment. My dad had some issues, but we worked it out as I got into my teens. And so both were very positive influences on me. But part of what I was able to do with my mom was talk through emotions, talk through my inner world. And that was, without realizing it, I was a very analytical kid. I was a very introverted kid. So I was constantly trying to figure out why I did what I did, what was my motivation, what influenced that decision, what caused me to act that way. It was constantly there. And in my teens, I actually got very discouraged because I couldn't figure it all out. I didn't yet have the knowledge base, the tools to kind of make sense of a lot of it. And so I kind of stopped doing it for a while because I was just paralysis, analysis, stuff going on. And so, but I was being trained in all of that and encouraged by my mom to explore my internal world, to understand my internal world and put it into words. And part of what frustrated me as a kid was in my own peer group, nobody else wanted to think that deeply. As I got older and got to know people, 99% of the people didn't want to talk at that deep level. And so I felt very much I had my mom to process with, but not many other people that really wanted to talk that deeply. And that was part of my own little journey and coming to accept that that's kind of the world I live in. And thankfully I had my mom and it was okay and it was good to do that. But once I started to get into this field and I started putting into words for people and helping people understand their stuff, and I realized the impact it was making, and I realized that people were hungry for that, and they were breaking into tears when I was putting into words their life and how do you know me and all of that. And all of a sudden, 30 years of me doing that privately with my mom, etc., was now bearing fruit, was now, oh, it was worth the journey of going down all of those long roads. And so that's why I just felt it was worth it. I feel honored that people are being helped by it. I still would have done it regardless of whether anybody was helped by it. But I don't feel, oh, ain't I brilliant? Ain't I? People are finally noticing me. No, that's just the way I was wired. That's just the environment I grew up with. That's just the way my brain worked. And I can't take credit for that. I was just kind of driven to pursue that as a kid without even understanding why. I'm just glad it's helping others now.
So it's there's been this like lifelong, deep desire for an understanding of the human condition and the
Exactly.
fullness of it without, kind of without hiding from the underside of it or the underbelly of it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you mentioned, that you've been deeply intellectual, deeply analytical. I'm gonna warn you here that I reached out to your daughters and your wife, and for some insights just to help guide me in these questions. And so, you use the words analytical, intellectual. I think one of them used the word nerd, and says that you have an app on your phone that follows big barges around on the river and tells you what they're carrying and where they're going. And so I was wondering if you could share maybe what are your 2 or 3 favorite apps on your phone?
Oh my goodness. So I have a sports app that lets me keep track of kind of sports scores, which I like. I have an app so my wife and 2 daughters are, it lets you know where they're at so you can follow kind of where they're at. I think for the nerd thing, for people to really understand me, is that when I was a kid, I was a hyper-focused kid. I had high energy, but when I got focused on a task, I got locked in. I was in a zone, and I enjoyed nothing more than being kind of in that zone of being focused on a particular task. And so that was me. And so when I want to accomplish this or get good at this or learn about this, okay, I was now in a zone of total focus. But what I realized was that made me very different from other kids. They're like, so in some ways my life was, to be in the zone for many people would appear nerdy or this guy's out of balance, this guy's extreme. But to me, that was just, I'm in a zone, I'm learning, I'm developing, I'm pursuing this. And that was go, green light. That was the way my brain worked. It took me a while. So to say beyond that, all of that being in the zone had nothing to do with relationship stuff. It was all about learning. It was all about developing skills that I did just him all by himself. That was me. And so relationships were a bit of a cumbersome thing for me that I wasn't too adept at. And so that's where kind of, to me, the nerdy thing was. And so for me, getting in relationships was a whole new skill set that had to be learned, but also learning to be present to people, because I would rather be present to an idea, to a pursuit, an activity, than people. And then learning to be balanced. That it wasn't just pursuing one priority in life and being in the zone. It was balancing very important priorities that were all equally important that I had to learn to do. So in some ways, I'm thankful that I started out in that very focused thing, because I think it saved me from a lot of bad decisions. It saved me from a lot of wrong pursuits, and it helped me really grow in knowledge. So when I was 12, I came home from school, and I was really good in sports, and I love sports. But all of a sudden, I just wanted to learn a particular topic. So I'd come home, this highly energetic kid, and I'd spend an hour just reading, force myself to read, because that was now a priority for me, and I wanted to do that. And then that grew to 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours when I was getting into high school, later into high school. And so it was just that very focused approach to life, which I'm very thankful for, but I'm glad I didn't stay there. I'm glad I learned about relationships, about being present, about becoming more balanced in life. That's been where I needed to end up, but that's where I had to start, and I'm glad for the progression.
Is this focus, do you consider, was it more of like a skill building or a knowledge building, or both?
I would say both. So at that point in time, I was very much dominated by my parents' strong Christian faith upbringing. And so it was when I was 11, 12 is when I just felt I want to pursue this way of life. And I felt, and looking back, I think there was definitely some genuine healthy parts, but there was also some unhealthy pieces to it. But it was, I want to pursue becoming a pastor. And so much of the focus was, okay, then I want to learn the Bible. I want to learn what it means to be a pastor. So that's the skill part. The knowledge part was learning the Bible. And that became a consuming passion for me. And so all through my teens, it was self-taught, listening to cassettes at that time of teachers and all of that, just learning. And again, much of my worldview's changed since then, but that's where I started. And that was a great place to start in many ways. It was what I needed. But that was really kind of where I was coming from and my whole approach. So it was very much dominated by their Christian worldview that I bought into, accepted, and was pursuing, that later got amended in a whole bunch of different ways. But at that point, it was 100% commitment to, I'm going to pursue becoming kind of this perfect little Christian.
So I hear kind of two things there. So one is that you're like this calling to be with other people, and that this calling to be with other people, to help other people, started at a really young age. But that there's a second kind of like this overlay of the parental influence as well.
Yeah, and definitely. And that call to help people originally had a very much kind of Christian pastoral, that the main way to help people was through kind of propagating Christianity, church life. Now that's all changed to much broader things. So the heart is still to help people. It's just the approach has broadened greatly. And so that's the key thing to me. So that as I look back on that, the very healthy part was something captured me at 11 and 12 that I want to spend my life caring for people, helping people. It took me many years to figure out what that would look like. I thought I knew what it was back then, but that changed dramatically. But we started with kind of that right internal compulsion that I want my life to be about helping people.
Mm-hmm. I think I plan to chat with you a bit about the work as a pastor and how that's changed. For a moment, I want to stay with the childhood. So your daughter Brienne, when I spoke with her, she mentioned that you're a delightful redneck who grew up living a very simple life. and that your grandmother would feed you dandelion salad,
Yes.
and that you also spent years working on different farms. Could you share some more about some of your early experiences?
Yeah, so my grandmother came, she was a St. Pierre that came from Scotland, from living in a castle, from living a very aristocratic life,
Mm-hmm.
tremendous wealth. And she just, from what I'm told, she just saw all the hypocrisy, all the looking down on other people, entitlement, that this isn't about love, this is about position and power. And she just rejected all of that. And so coming to Canada, she just chose of her own accord that she was going to basically live hand to mouth poverty. And so they lived a super simple life. Like I remember, we hated as kids going to grandma's house because she was a terrible cook, and she would give us these dandelion salads. She would, if we ate an apple, we'd have to eat the core as well. Like it was just extreme living as if you were in extreme poverty, and could have been extremely wealthy, but that was their lifestyle choice. So that's what my dad grew up in. That's what kind of we were exposed. My mom, her parents were farmers that came out of the Depression, and so they lived very simple lives as well. And so my dad, he had a very successful job, but he wanted to become a pastor, so he became a lay pastor. And then when he became a full-time pastor and gave up his job, he said he was going to give half of whatever he made as a pastor away and just live on half of the income. And so basically it was, we choose to live poor. And so I was raised in a very small town. So I worked on a apple farm, a mushroom farm, a vegetable farm. Growing up, that was our summers. Then we were involved in my dad got asked to direct a camp, a children's family camp. And so we became kind of maintenance guys. So we were doing construction stuff, all kinds of maintenance type work. So life was really country living, working hard. We cut wood for firewoods. All of that was part of our upbringing. We had a huge garden that fed a freezer, that fed food that let us live cheaply. So a big part of our lives was preparing the garden, weeding the garden, harvesting the garden, etc. So, but my grandparents, like living poor, they went and lived on Manitoulin Island in Canada, which is really, it's like it's 100 years behind the rest of Canada. It's very remote, very backwoodsy, and so it was just, everything was just redneck. Everything was just that mindset. And we grew up in that. That's all we knew. We loved it. It was a good life in so many ways. And so when I first met Kim and all of a sudden around all these cultured people, it was like, what in the world is this world? It was just very foreign. But so I'm still a redneck at heart. And I'm most comfortable in that world.
Mm-hmm. So you're familiar with farm labor, with maintenance work. A question that comes up for me out of this, talking about that choice to live poor, but also your father choosing to give away half of his earnings. Thinking about like an abundance mindset versus a scarcity mindset. What did you grow up with? Did any of this create a sense of scarcity for you? Or is this something where you were able to see generosity and abundance? And
yeah, it's a great question. Not easy to answer. So we never felt poor. Looking back as kids, we always had enough to eat. We always had good food. I wore hand-me-downs all my life until I was in high school. I got the first pair of new clothes that I ever owned. But it wasn't a big deal. Never even thought of of that. So we didn't see ourselves as poor. But looking back, to me, there was some scarcity mindset stuff that we picked up just by being in that I've had to kind of work through. And so I'm so like, basically what came out of that was my mom and dad they could give us a little bit of money to help us get through university, but they couldn't pay for university. So we had to learn how to manage money well. We had to learn to work and our way and provide money to get through university. So we got so many good skills around how to view money, how to manage money, all of that came out of that. And also just an overwhelming thing that tied in with kind of my life is about giving, about generous, about helping others. You got to take care of your own needs, but the more you can help others, the better. That was, mom and dad lived that. That was part of what we went through. But when my kids came along, I was still in that mindset that give away lots of stuff, live very poorly, and my kids suffered for that because they didn't grow up in the generation I grew up in. And so for them to wear hand-me-downs would get them teased and laughed at. And so I did damage to my kids because I hung on to that mindset too much. And so it took a while. It actually took Brianne getting really upset one day for me to start to realize that I need to rethink this scarcity approach to life as being a virtue, and that it's okay to enjoy some of the things of life as well. Mm-hmm. And that was huge for me because to me, what partly came out of the scarcity mindset was almost that it was wrong to enjoy stuff too much, because then you're acting snobbish. And all of these things, it's okay to enjoy them. It's okay to do without them, but it's okay to enjoy them if they're there. So it's been a gradual process of learning to rethink all of that for many years. So
yeah. So it's like not having much, but it seems like that was always enough. And then I like what you added here at the end because there's a cultural shift, a cultural adaptation that needs to happen just to kind of be aware of the surroundings and what your children are going through as well, and to fit with that. So you mentioned your mom and having this secure attachment with her, and could you talk a little bit more about your mom, your relationship with her, kind of her role throughout your life?
Yeah. So my mom and dad had 4 kids. So I was the second oldest. So there's older brother, me, younger brother, and then younger sister. All 4 of us are very different. And my mom, looking back now, kind of based on what I understand today, is the beauty about my mom was she accepted each of us for who we are and was determined to connect with us where we were at. So much of parenting at that time is kids just obey. Here's what we want of you. Do what you're told. And if you do what you're told, then we'll connect with you. My mom was not that. She was, I'm going to connect with you where you're at, and then obedience will flow out of healthy connection. And it did. And so looking back, here am I, this very introverted, high energy, focused kid who's not great socially. She just accepted that. Here's this kid that likes talking about stuff nobody else talks about. She would just sit and listen. So I used to come home from school and I would jump up on the kitchen counter when she was cooking supper and I just tell her about my day and chat. So the flip side to me that I look back on now that I wish, so she had her own trauma stuff, but had worked through a lot of it. But 2 things that I wish she had grown more in, but she wasn't there, culture wasn't there. And so it's just a wish. It never could have been reality. But She still was very stoic emotionally, though we knew we were accepted and loved. She just didn't show a lot of physical affection to us on a regular basis. Now, she tells me that as a little kid, she used to kiss us every night, hug us, tell us that she loved us. And I guess when I was like 4, I said, "Don't do that, Mom. I don't like you." So I kind of had these physical boundaries that she just respected. And she didn't try to kiss me after that or hug me. And so I don't remember that, but that's what she tells me. But looking back, I wish she had maybe tried again because I know how much that would have helped. And then the second thing was she listened superbly well, didn't share a ton unless we asked a specific question. Then she would give us a full answer, but she didn't share of her own initiative a whole lot. So that was the other. The other thing that to me was so important looking back is so much of the Christian world at that time was, and still is, we'll accept you as long as you conform to our morals. And if you don't, we'll judge you. What I knew with my mom is I could come and share, here's what I'm doing in my life, here's what I've done, and there wouldn't be judgment. She would hear me, she would accept me where I'm at, she would talk about it free of judgment. And that, to me, looking back, was so huge in my own personal growth. She let me grow without her criticizing every little thing that didn't quite meet the norms. So that to me was very huge. So my mom was an extreme introvert like me. She was a thinker. And I think the other piece to me to try to put her into terms was I only have a couple memories in my life where mom got dysregulated in her limbic brain. She, I don't know how, I don't know kind of all that led to it, but she lived out of her cortex better than anybody that I know. And it was, what is healthy? I'm going to do it whether I feel like it or not. I'm tired, I'm exhausted, I'm cranky, but I'm still going to be present to my kids. I'm still going to listen. And there was a consistency every single day that she was present, she was there, living out of her cortex. And I think that to me is probably one of the greatest blessings that I got from my mom.
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear. What I hear you describing is conditional love, or sorry, the wrong one, unconditional love. Unconditional love being acted out, where you were allowed to be who you were allowed to develop, to come as you are, and just to unfold into the person that you could become. You mentioned too that she worked on some of her own trauma. Was this something that, as we really live in this world of complex trauma now, and I know in the past there was more like the mental illnesses were known, but not necessarily the connection to complex trauma. And I also know that, back when you were growing up, I think there's a lot more stigma around trauma, mental illness. Was she actively seeking help, or did she have something that she was doing for herself?
So her mom and dad, who came out of the Depression as farmers, I would say, again, looking back, my maternal grandmother had huge anxiety issues. They did not have a good relationship, grandma and grandpa. They coexisted, but they basically lived separate lives, and they kept a lot of secrets from each other about what they were doing outside of stuff. And so that's what my mom grew up as a single child. So she was doted on by both parents, but didn't have any friends because they were out in northern Ontario on a farm. And so she was very lonely much of her life. Very smart, but very lonely. I think it was two things with her. She it was her kind of her faith, her connection with her higher power, and her relationship with my dad that really helped her work through a lot of kind of the pain that came out of that, to figure out, okay, my parents didn't have a healthy relationship. What would a healthy relationship look like? What do we have to do to get to that? And they worked so hard to develop this healthy relationship. And I would say my mom and dad had a wonderful relationship where they were constantly communicating, working through issues, resolving conflict, being open about everything with each other, trusting. They were best of friends. And somehow they figured that out by looking at kind of, we don't want to be this, but what would the opposite look like? And they had some kind of mentors in their life that helped them. So mom, as far as I know, never went to like a therapist, a counselor. This was all kind of her personal journey with the mentors of her life.
It's great that she was able to do just the, you know, I know how hard it is for so many people to kind of take responsibility, even be aware of their own lives, and then take responsibility for it and then work through it. And so it sounds that your mom and that your parents, through their relationship, found their own sources of help, but also, you know, worked
Yeah.
on it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so you mentioned your father having a little bit more of a difficult relationship with your father, and I'd also asked Brittany had told me that you also learned your sense of humor from your father, and so I was wondering if you could maybe touch on both of those, as maybe some of the difficult areas, but also some of these areas that where you gain this sense of humor, and what your sense of humor is like.
Oh, I don't even know how to describe my sense of humor. It's that quirky English, self-deprecating, bit of sarcasm, dry. Yeah. So, and most of it's with family or friends that it comes out. My dad, so his mom came from this very wealthy place and chose poverty. And so they had 8 children. But the child next to my dad died at birth. But they were severe, almost cultish religious. Tons and tons of rules, just very, very cultish. And so dad was growing up in that and coming out of that. He was seeing that something's not right here, so he was finding his own way. But I think looking back from that, he had his own religious trauma issues that I don't know that he ever saw, but there was a ton of shame issues that were involved in that, because you never quite met the mark of all the rules. You were always the bad sinner, etc. So looking back, I see a lot of kind of shame stuff with dad, but dad was driven to become a pastor, but the denomination parents were in and that he was getting out of didn't have pastors. So he did a lot of traveling speaking, itinerant speaking stuff, but he had 4 children of his own, so he had a full-time job plus all of this itinerant stuff. So he was basically a workaholic. And so that, to me, he was doing what he thought was right, what he thought God wanted him to do. And he was working basically 2 jobs. And so as kids, all of us kids just felt dad was always too busy to play with us. Dad was always too busy to spend time with us. And that's where all 4 of us kids were hurt. And my younger brother started to rebel going into high school. And it was my mom that got into my dad's face and said, "You are too busy. You're not present to your kids. You're not taking time to get to know your kids." And he heard her. And so one day, my dad was driving my younger brother and I to school. And he said it as my dad would say it. He says, "Your mom's been in my ear about not spending enough time with you guys. I want you to be fully honest with me knowing I want to hear from you. Do you think I spend enough time with you? And both my brother and I said, no, you don't. And he said, okay, I'll change. And from that day on, there was this huge shift. He started to do kind of days with each of us kids. He knew I loved walking in the bush. We had a big woods by us, and so we'd go for walks all the time, just in the bush and talk. And I loved it. It was fantastic. And that was when I started to be able to build connection with my dad. But my dad was more of the extrovert. He had been a salesman, did very well at that, and had just had this quirky kind of humor and ability to interact with people and take kind of tense situations and put a spin on them that made everybody relax and kind of chuckle a little bit. And so I got all of that kind of from my dad, but that's a little bit of my dad's story.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a really good example in there too. You know, we work with a lot of parents, and you know, there's that fear that you've damaged your kids through your actions, and I love here how in your story it shows that, you know, there's that chance to change, to move forward in a different way, and to build that connection.
Yeah, and my younger brother, right after that time, there was this huge shift in him as well. All of a sudden, all of that kind of rebellious stuff disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just kind of neat for me as a brother to watch the shift, that because up till then he was becoming this very angry. He was lashing out at kind of his siblings, his parents, and that just disappeared. We started to become really good friends. So it just showed to me the power of healing that comes out of finally being able to connect with that parent. When they become safe, when they become present, then amazing the problems that disappear in the children.
Yeah. You mentioned, you know, with the grandparents, you know, one of the things that I find is that sometimes like people will value rules over people, or they value efficiency over people. And it's really finding that place of being able to truly connect with another human being. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that my dad initially as a parent valued rules over people, but after that he valued us over rules. And that was a very important shift as well, because now he really worked to get us, to see us, to be present to us, to connect with us, to understand us, to walk with us in our journey, not just tell us where we should be. And so all of that became such an important part of our healing and growth through our turbulent teens.
I want to do a slight detour here. You briefly touched on athletics and academics. Could you tell me maybe a little bit more about your school life? Athletics, you said you were a very energetic person. So what type of sports did you play? How were friendships and relationships in school? What sort of subjects did you enjoy?
Yeah, so part of, to me, looking back, and it's just, I'm very grateful for, I couldn't have made it happen. It just was natural, but I was very smart. I never studied for an exam or test until I was in university. I just never had to. I just learned it as they were teaching it, and I got basically straight A's. So I was naturally smart in pretty much every topic and enjoyed school, did well at school. So I got validation to an extent from that. Mom and Dad, I think, again, looking back, they didn't put over validation on accomplishments. They put the main validation on becoming good people, not on your accomplishments. But I was also very good in sports, one of the kind of best athletes in our school. So I played every sport, but I really I began to excel mainly in volleyball and basketball. My parents at that point wouldn't let me play hockey. Like, we played rink hockey in the winter, but not organized hockey because the games were on Sunday and that would conflict with church. So no hockey. They wouldn't let me play football because mom said, no, you're going to get injured and you're going to regret it later on in life. So I'm just setting a boundary right now, no football. So I played as much pickup football as I could, but never pads, equipment, organized football. Soccer, I loved soccer, but it conflicted with volleyball, which I loved more. And so then I got into squash, racquetball, as I got older. And then I always loved walking in nature, and that became really, really big. I played lacrosse for a little while. Like, you name it, I basically tried it and did well at it. But once I kind of got this growing direction in my life that I was moving towards pastoral work, I just did sports less and less. Oh, and the other thing, in my teens, I started weightlifting, and naturally all of a sudden developed this. You can look. I don't show these pictures anymore, but I became quite muscular, and I thought, oh, I got the body to be a bodybuilder. Maybe I should consider being a bodybuilder. So I did that for a little bit. And then my brothers and we played ping pong or table tennis all the time. That was a common little sport that we had. So sports was just, we had a basketball net on our garage. In the winter, Mom would set up a Christmas card line, and we'd make a balloon and play volleyball with a balloon over the Christmas card line. Like, we played hockey in our basement in the winter, just on the floor. We were constantly doing all of that. My brother got big into playing cards, like sports cards. So the big thing became, you would set up a card against the wall and see who could get closest to it or knock it over. So we'd play that for hours. Like, it was just constant activity. So again, what I'm thankful for about my mom, she never cared about this pristine house. She would let us take all the furniture out of the living room, set up wrestling mats and wrestle all day, play volleyball all day, whatever. She said, you guys are boys, you're busy, that's how you're wired. I am going to let you get all your energy out, play your sports, and I know you're here at home safe and doing good stuff than out running around getting yourself in trouble. And so that was our home life. It was basically a sports arena that we were constantly coming up with new things to do.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're naturally gifted. You also had a lot of opportunity. Did you have a big preference at all between any like team sports or more individual? You mentioned some of the racket sports.
Yeah, I like both. To me, both I excelled at. Both had pros and cons. So I got to give you kind of one more piece here. And so part of where my parents were coming from out of that kind of cultish religion was, we weren't allowed to have a TV in our house until I was 16. So when we went to my friend's house and they were watching like the NBA or the NHL, I was enthralled by watching sports on TV. And so my dad, thankfully, to his credit, we had a neighbor that when the hockey playoffs came on, if the Toronto Maple Leafs or Montreal was in it, they would invite us over to watch the playoffs, and Dad would take us over to watch. So he made an exception to some of the rules. But what I found was, wow, I am enthralled by watching these gifted athletes perform at top of game. It just creates a sense of awe in me to sit and watch this skill level unfold. And so I just had this huge love of sports that grew into just enjoying watching sports.
A lot of opportunity to be embodied, and not having that TV in a way like creates so much of that time and space.
Yeah, well. And I think looking back, I think we suffered a little bit because we weren't taught a balanced life early on. I had to learn that gradually. But yet, by not having a TV, we just put all of our energy into playing sports. And that was actually quite a good way to grow up. And we kept really busy, and I really enjoyed it. So we never felt ripped off.
Mm-hmm.
Occasionally we did when everybody else was watching something and we couldn't. But for the most part, we never felt ripped off for not having a TV. We just had the very full, rich lives.
Nice. Can I ask, who is Kim Williams?
That's my wife.
Okay. I needed to make sure because I understand that you wrote in your Bible something along the lines of "I love Jesus" and Kim Williams when you were a child.
So when I think I was 6 or 7, Kim's family moved to the town next door to us and started coming to our church. So Kim had a twin sister, and both of them were very, they were trained by their dad to be out there, initiate stuff, and were kind of, I would say, overly romanticized by their parents. And so when they started coming to our church, both of them liked my brother and I. And so they started sending us messages that they loved us. And so that's when I wrote in my Bible that I love Kim Williams. And so that was a childhood thing. And so the important part is that happened, over the kind of 6, 7, 8 in there. And then when they hit their teens, I couldn't stand them. They were quite obnoxious to me. And then when I was in university, what I did at that point is I just said to Mom, I trust your read on people more than my own oxytocin. So you tell me if you see somebody that you think would be a good wife, that would be great for a relationship. And so Kim had been working at the camp that Mom and Dad directed. And Mom came home and said, I never really respected Kim much before this, but I saw her this summer, and that girl has grown up to be a wonderful woman. So I phoned her the next day, and I said, would you be willing to go out on a date? So that was all based on, wasn't an arranged marriage, but I just trusted my mom's read on people. She was so intuitive that I followed that. And we dated. I went out for 5 dates, and I said, yep, I think this is the right one. Because I didn't date just to have fun. I dated to gather information. Again, I got in that focused place. So on our 5th date, we were driving along the road. I didn't even know what romantic was, and I proposed to her while we were driving down the road, and she just didn't know what to do with it. She didn't even know if I was serious. And then she said, give me a week to think about it, and the week later she came back and said, I'll marry you, and a few months later we were married. So it was not typical, not normal in the culture. It worked for us. I wouldn't recommend it for others, but thankfully it worked, and it kind of, all of the weird ways I was wired were coming together in all of that. But
I have a lot more questions on that, but there's a slight detour that I want to take just because of one word that you used. You mentioned oxytocin. And so I know that one of the things that you share in your teachings is about how, using love as a choice, and kind of rather than falling for that the drug chemical, like that feeling that we feel. So how as a teenage boy, young man, were you in this more of a love as a choice and not following the oxytocin?
Again, I've thought about this question many times, Andy, and it's part of my weird way I'm wired, how I was raised, what I observed. So we worked every summer from the time I was 15 until I went to university at this camp. And part of being at this camp, they had a teen camp every year. So they get 100 teenagers that would come in for this week of camp. And me as an introvert working, I'm not super involved in the activities of the camp. I'm more observing. And what I saw at the end of every teen camp was everybody had fallen in love. Everybody's crying. We're going to love each other for blah, 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 blah. And a month later, they've all broken up. They've all fallen apart. And so I just began to realize this is more infatuation than love. This is more what we call oxytocin now. And I just saw there was a shallowness to it. They didn't even know each other. It was all based on feelings and emotions. And I just realized that's not how to build a strong relationship. That's not how to define whether a relationship is going to work. So I got to somehow recognize I'm going to have those feelings, but not let them drive the car. I got to get to know the person. I got to find out, is this a healthy enough person to have a healthy relationship? So that was helped by my upbringing. That's what was instilled in me growing up, is relationships aren't about the emotions so much. They come and go. It's about becoming healthy people. And so those two things meshed. And then my mind was, I want to explore the internal world. I want to get to know the person. It's not about falling in love and huggy kissy stuff. It's about getting to know the person. And so those three things came together to shape kind of how I approached dating. And so I had dated a few girls before Kim, and some went a few months, some went longer, but at some point I got past the initial emotional attraction and I started to get to know the person without the emotions in the way. And all of a sudden I began to go, oh, this is a different person that I'm finding than what I thought, when all those emotions were clouding my judgment. And so it was really, okay, my experience was now showing, get past the emotions to actually see the person more accurately before you make kind of decisions. So again, I was a weird duck when it comes to all of that.
Yeah. What I hear coming out of that is really just, again, this deep study of the human condition as you were a kid, and then following the path of what you learned with that.
Yeah, and that's what I think my mom and dad taught me, is life is about not living out of your limbic brain, following your emotions, because they'll often mislead you. You got to find out in your cortex what does healthy look like and follow that path. And at first it might seem painful, difficult, require self-discipline, but if you stick at it, the benefits will be huge. And I was just trained that way, and I'm so thankful, because that's what we teach all of our clients. That's how to have a healthy life. So.
Yeah. And it's something like I've been aware on my own journey, as you mentioned. I call it the honeymoon stage. It lasts for a month, 3 months, 6 months. And then where does the relationship really stand after? And can you be honest with yourself about it? And it's so, I don't know. It's been difficult for me in my past.
Yeah. And if I can add another piece, as I look back, so again, this is all hindsight realizations, which to me a lot of growth ends up being. But I was raised in a Christian environment that understood love very well in some senses, but confused it with codependency in other senses. And so to be a good Christian meant you sacrifice your needs for others. And so there's a place for that, but that was set as the norm, that you're always putting others ahead of yourself. You become more attuned to the needs of others. So I was actually trained, without realizing it, to be codependent. And thinking I was being a loving person. And so a big part of my growth in relationships was realizing my needs matter just as much as the other person's. I need to be attuned to myself just as much as them. I got to stand up for myself and all of that. And so that to me was an important piece. And then the second piece was that Christian upbringing was very giving, very loving, very being there for people, but began to be confused as love doesn't have boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
So I have memories of Dad doing an activity with us and then somebody just showing up at our house ringing the doorbell wanting to talk to my dad and Dad not saying no. Or people phoning and Dad's doing something with us, but Dad won't say no to the person because love doesn't say no. And so love doesn't set boundaries. And so part of my journey has been realizing that no, love sets boundaries, because for Dad to love that person, he didn't love his own kids at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And he was doing damage to his kids. So love can't love everybody equally in every situation. It's therefore got to have some boundaries to protect those that you are responsible to love. What I got was a very loving environment, but there were those two areas where it got distorted: codependency and boundaries. And that took me a while to figure out and to really kind of retrain myself, because what came out of that teaching was, if you set a boundary, you're being selfish.
Mm-hmm.
If you say no to somebody, you're being unloving, and so now you felt guilt, but that was actually false guilt. And so I had to retrain my conscience in all of that stuff. And so I think the bottom line is, to me, this whole dating thing, I started down a road with a lot of good tools, but some not so good tools that I had to gradually figure out. And just thankfully I had enough good tools initially and enough tools about how to think through things and get more information that enabled me to gradually get other tools.
So what kind of with those two main things under the codependence, kind of the sacrificing to others and then also the boundary part, how old were you? What age were you? And maybe, what were some of the things you did? How long was this process of retraining your conscious?
Well, I think to me, all of it, to answer that question, I got to first answer this. I didn't begin to see the problems in it until after I'd been a pastor for 11 years. So as a pastor, here I was being super pastor, but I also had 3 young children that were born, and I wanted to be a super dad. And I was married, and so all of a sudden my responsibilities were increasing, but the days weren't getting any longer. and so I was burning myself out, but I didn't feel I could say no to people. I didn't feel I could change how I did service and loving people, because that would be unloving, until my health started to give out and I started to burn out. And I began to I was forced to go, what's going on here? Where did I go wrong? Because what became evident was I didn't get a virus. This wasn't some medical freak thing. I didn't have cancer. This was something that I created trauma for myself, complex trauma. And why did I create complex trauma? Because of some bad teaching. And that then created an environment where I didn't feel safe. I felt overwhelmed, constantly stressed, constantly give, never say no. And when I began to see that, and it took me a while to figure that out after I got sick, but it took me probably 5 to 10 years to really start to get that sorted out in my mind, that this is what is going on. And all of my health issues, the needing to resign as a pastor, and then the 7 years of difficulty that followed with health, mental health issues, I brought that on myself because of some bad teaching that then created a complex trauma environment for myself. And initially, it wasn't a problem because I was a high energy kid. I love digging deep. I love pushing myself. I got a rush out of doing that. And so I did that as a pastor for years, thinking, hey, this is great. I can do this, without realizing it was taking its toll. And eventually my body was saying no. And then all the repercussions came out of that. But again, I wouldn't say I grew up in a complex trauma environment that my parents created, but some of the teaching they gave me caused me to create a complex trauma environment for myself.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction just of how kind of our belief systems can influence so deeply, like how we act, engage with the world, engage in relationships that can cause problems for us and in our life. How, when you mentioned the burnout, what were some of the physical or mental characteristics of what you were going through?
I think initially it was I would fall asleep at night and sleep a couple hours and wake up. And then I'd be awake the rest of the night. So I was getting 2 to 3 hours of sleep a night. So that then led to feeling tired all the time, feeling flu-like achy all the time. Then it led to depression. I just got increasingly struggled with depression. Then I started having anxiety issues that began to happen. And then everything in me just wanted to avoid anything that was a responsibility because I just didn't have the energy to do it. I didn't want to resolve conflicts. I didn't want to deal with issues or problems. It was just, I was checking out. I was in fight, flight, freeze mode. So what happened is after being a pastor for 5 years, I started having the sleep issues. And so I went to the board and I just said, something's going on physically for me. And again, I didn't know that I'd created my own complex trauma. I just thought something physical was going on. So they said, work half time, go to doctors, specialists, whatever, get this figured out, because that's the priority. So I went to working half time and went to doctor after doctor after doctor, test after test after test for everything under the sun. And it kept coming back to, we can't find anything. So finally they just said, we're going to lump it under chronic fatigue syndrome. So we don't even know for sure what causes chronic fatigue syndrome, but you got all the symptoms of chronic fatigue syndrome. So I just said, okay, I got chronic fatigue syndrome. Again, still didn't know that was a result of complex trauma. It was just, I've got it. I caught it somehow. So they let me continue working half time. So I continued working half time for 5 years. But I was pushing myself more and more and more. And so eventually after the 5 years, like I think have one picture of me at that time. And Kim just still shudders to look at it because my eyes are just black. They're dead. I got, I think, Brittany on my lap, and it's just like you can tell this is a very sick man. So eventually I just said, I can't continue. I have to resign. And they were very gracious, and I resigned and went on disability. Yeah, so that's kind of the gradual progression, but it started with not being able to sleep.
And so you mentioned, Brittany on your lap. So I know at this time, you were married and you had a few young children. Like, what was the effect of this on your family?
Well, again, when we got married, I looked forward to being a dad. I had always loved kids. So part of what I did in my teens, university years is I worked in a program with children, and I just love working with children. So I was so looking forward to being a dad. And when I got sick, Brienne was 1 year old, Brittany was 3 years old, and Philip was 4 years old. And so up until then, when Philip was the first 4 years, I was just super involved in his life, played with him all the time. Same with Britt. And then I got sick, and it just like their dad was abandoned them. He was no longer present in their life. And so they all went through severe abandonment issues. And so I still tried to be, check in with them on their way to school, say hi, eat breakfast with them, have supper with them, say goodnight to them, read a story. So I still tried to do daily little check-ins.
Mm-hmm.
But as they got older, that wasn't enough. And so they just spent more and more time with their friends because it wasn't, what are they going to do at home with dad being sick? It was boring. And so they just gradually grew further and further away because they couldn't connect with dad, so they were going to connect with friends. And so the damage that was taking inside of them caused all of them to have major kind of complex trauma issues around abandonment. Thankfully, once I started to figure out what was going on and begin to deal with my own trauma and the belief system that came with that, and to get stable health-wise again, I was able to reconnect with all three of my kids, and now we have a fantastic relationship, and the healing that's taken place in all three of their lives has been huge, but it required me getting my act together and figuring out I brought all this on myself because of some bad teaching, and I got to make some major changes in my beliefs, but also in my behaviors to get healthy again and then to reconnect with my kids. So.
I have a follow-up on that, but I want to first ask, this shows, sometimes complex trauma happens because of actions by our parents, but then sometimes too that abandonment is from a parent being sick or dying. Do you notice, sometimes the age that trauma happens at is very important, and it's very different whether you're 1 year old, 4 year old, 13-year old. Did you notice any difference in your own family based off of the ages that they were when you were in this burned out stage?
So my trauma came from my parents being good parents, following the advice and kind of the wisdom of their generation, but some bad teaching that came with that. So it wasn't intentional. It wasn't that we're setting out to abuse or neglect you. It was, for the most part, very good parents in many ways, but there was some pieces missing, but they were following the teaching of their culture. Mine, based on that teaching, then following that teaching, I become sick, and I wanted to be this wonderful dad, but couldn't. So again, not intentional. And so to me, much of complex trauma, it's important for people to understand, is it's not that your parents did it intentionally. And so you're not blaming them in a negative sense, oh, you're terrible parents. It was, okay, I understand what you did, why you did it, and how it affected me. That's really what I'm trying to figure out here, not blame you, et cetera, et cetera. It's just, this is what happened. So my kids were very young. They were basically before I was able to start repairing the damage. There was a 5 to 7 year stretch where they kind of didn't have dad very involved in their life. When I did interact with them, I tried to make it meaningful, fun, communicate. So there's still some good stuff happening in those 5 years, but there was still damage happening every day because of absence. So it was being mitigated to a degree, but not totally taken away. So I think part of what I'm saying is it's the length they were in the trauma that's also significant, not just the ages. What I've seen with people is the earlier the trauma starts, it's more how long they then had to live in their coping mechanisms and how deeply entrenched the patterns of those coping mechanisms became established. That determines the difficulty of the healing journey. It's not so much the age that it takes place. The greater emphasis is on the length of staying in the coping.
Okay. Yeah. It's kind of like how long you were conditioned.
Yeah.
Underneath that pattern.
Yeah. And so your brain sets up all its subconscious programs based on how often you reinforced that particular program. And if you did it for 30 years and now you want to change that program, well, it's not willing to just make a few changes quickly. Whereas if you only did that program for a couple of years, the brain's much more plastic and as far as reprogramming itself.
I think that actually ties in with this other question that I was going to go with you is, you talk a lot about how long it takes to reparent, to reprogram. And so kind of as a two-part, how long did it take you kind of before you achieved maybe some sort of what you felt was a sense of normal, but also what were the sources and the tools that you were discovering or that you were using as you began your work with your own complex trauma?
Yeah, so again, a couple parts to this that are, I think, important to understand. So my worldview growing up was everything was seen through a Christian lens. The Bible was the basis of truth and the final authority. And so thankfully, my dad had come to a point where he had broadened his sources of input from just the cultish upbringing he had. So he was starting to broaden his thinking, etc., and encouraged all of us to kind of get a broader perspective on things. But it was still very Christian, very Christian. And so we got a lot of good tools from that. That's my point. It wasn't a complete set of tools, but there was a lot of good beginning tools that came out of that. It wasn't until after I was sick, came off a disability, worked on farms for 5 years, trying to get my health back, that I was then approached by a lady at our church asking me to work at a treatment center. And it was the only treatment center in Canada that really saw addiction as a symptom of deeper problems. So we didn't have the terminology at that point to call it complex trauma. At that point, it was called adult children of alcoholics, adult children of dysfunction. But something happened in the child's childhood that caused them to begin to cope in maladaptive ways that set them up for addiction. So that set me on a new path, a new way of thinking, a new way of diagnosing why we behave the way we do. But it also meshed with my childhood, and what I realized was the power of a parent's influence, that I lived that in my own life. If you have an absent dad, it starts causing problems in the kids. If you have a dad who's connecting, all of a sudden the problems go away and the kids want to obey. The kids want to follow in their dad's footsteps. When you have a mom that's absent, problems. If you have a mom that connects, wonderful things. So it meshed with my upbringing, and what I saw is the power of a parent's influence shapes the child's life, whether they connect or not. So, but it broadened that to begin to explore it and to begin to understand that. And that's what then helped me see, oh, that's where my issues come from. So it was working with clients that actually I began to teach myself and begin to have the tools to diagnose myself and understand my problems from a more accurate perspective, and then the solutions to those problems. So it was kind of being dropped into the field, being forced to sink or swim, learning the information, and then realizing how much it applies to you, to yourself, and being willing to apply it, and making yourself your own first client is really what it boils down to, and growing, and then that then helps you help others.
Yeah, so a lot of your learning and growth came in a way from serving and helping others, and then kind of turning back and looking at yourself as you're doing that.
Yeah, and I think another piece of my childhood comes in is I was so driven to learn as a kid that I was constantly reading, listening to tapes, etc., wanting to learn, had this thirst to learn. So when I got dropped in this field, I read and learned everything. And they sent me to courses and all of that, but I read everything I could on adult children of alcoholics, adult children of dysfunction. And then Dr. Gabor-Mate came on and said everybody that he deals with that struggles with addiction has childhood trauma. And so all of a sudden trauma came on the thing. So I read everything I could get my hands on. So I was always a self-motivated learner. And that was important because this was a brand new field. There were only a few voices. Bessel van der Kolk, Gabor-Mate, Pete Walker were basically initially all I could find to read on. It was a brand new field. And so what I began to realize is I'm learning more about complex trauma by teaching clients every day what I'm learning, getting their feedback. That's expanding, that's broadening my knowledge, that's helping me see it from different angles to see different nuances and facets. And so I just started accumulating more and more pieces to understanding this that were being corroborated by what I was reading from others. But it was really, if I wasn't a self-student, I never would have grown in this field because there just wasn't information available at that point. It wasn't even a word. Complex traumas didn't come on until 15 years ago. And then that was still such a vague concept. So I realized I had to be a pioneer in understanding this. And part of that was going to be learning through reading and all of that. But part of it was going to be learning through teaching, working with clients, counseling, experiential stuff. And the two would have to come together to kind of form what then later became material that we teach.
So in a way, your childhood, your study of your lifelong study of the human condition,
all the pieces come together
and having that experience. Are there parts of healing that you still find personally challenging? Areas that you still struggle with or work with?
Well, I think it's so important to say is that to me each year my self-awareness grows. And as my self-awareness, like there's still parts of me that I'm discovering. I think I know myself quite well, but there's still pieces that I get little nuances that, that's interesting. And that leads to new growth. And so I'm not at a point in the journey where I can say, here's where I need to grow in the next year in all of these different areas, because I've grown in all the areas that I've seen. And there's ongoing maintenance every day as far as continuing to do the things necessary to facilitate growing. But it's now as something new comes to my realization, okay, what do I need to do to work on that, to heal that? And so some of that comes from just a memory that pops in, and all of a sudden, let's rethink that memory now from where I'm at with the knowledge I have. And all of a sudden I get all kinds of new insights. Or it comes from getting triggered today by something, and it goes, okay, what's going on here? Why is this trigger happening? And then exploring that. Or it comes from reading something or listening to some a podcast, and all of a sudden, oh, that's a new piece of information or a new piece of research. Now let's process through all of that. And that takes me to new places, and that leads to new self-awareness and new growth. So there's still growth happening. There's still healing happening. There's just nothing right now that's on the visible radar that I'm going, okay, this is where I need to grow. What I realized was when I became sick and I was just overwhelmed with all of these responsibilities and stresses, my go-to became flight and freeze. And so what I have to watch out for today is if I start to see myself going into numb and avoid, which is flight and freeze, what's going on here? Because my brain is kicking into an unhealthy coping style. So it must feel overwhelmed by something. And so that to me has become just important to catch the early warning signs that something's happening below the surface that I'm not consciously aware of, that I need to become aware of, because it's sending me down old patterns. So that to me is an ongoing daily kind of inventory taking of what's going on in my body, what's going on in my emotional world, what's going on as far as my overall stress levels, where's my brain at, all of those kind of things. And then what behaviors are manifesting themselves as wanting to kind of be acted on, impulses, all of that. So it's that kind of mindfulness growing more and more in mindfulness of all parts of me. And I think the other piece to me is just checking in regularly. If I'm feeling a bit of angst, discontent, anxiety, it's, okay, where am I at? Have I been meeting my 12 needs? And I think, again, part of being trained the way I was with kind of that codependency, love is give, 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 is I wasn't super aware of my own needs. I actually was quite good at meeting my needs without realizing it. But there were certain things that I just didn't even realize was a need that I could own. I would feel guilty if I expressed certain needs, like that was being selfish. And so you kind of disconnect a little bit from your needs when you're growing up in that environment. And so it's been a journey to become aware of what my needs are, to become aware that an unmet need is trying to get my attention, and what is that need and how do I meet it. And so getting more proficient at that, to me, is still a job in progress. And I'm pretty good at it, but it's still, growth is required.
You preempted my next question a little bit. I was going to ask, what are some of the thoughts, sensations, or behaviors that you notice as, for you personally, as you're numbing and avoiding? And you mentioned a little bit like the angst or the anxiety starting to come up. Are there other kind of thoughts or behaviors that you notice?
Yeah, so I would say a couple other ones that to me become significant, and that is just more irritable. So the slightest little thing that doesn't go exactly according to plan, instead of going, oh, that's a mild frustration, deal with it, no big deal, it's irritation. And so if I catch myself a bit shorter with Kim, that's, okay, what's going on here? And often with me, it's part of growing up with a very Christian worldview is you have this very clear standard. The bar is set quite high. You need to live this very moral life. You need to live this very disciplined life. And so I always had very high expectations of myself that were placed on me by others, but then I placed on them myself. And because I was smart and gifted, I was quite good at meeting the expectations. But what I realize often is I set unrealistic expectations of myself, and then would get down on myself And I set unrealistic expectations of others that caused me to be annoyed with others, judgmental of others, irritated with others. And so part of what I have to go through when I'm finding myself irritable is, okay, is this an unrealistic expectation? Is this I'm just feeling overwhelmed? Like there's different options that I have to explore. It's not just one thing. So anyways, that's a long answer to that one. But then the second thing is, I find it when I'm starting to get overwhelmed, I find it more difficult to be totally present to people.
Mm-hmm.
I just got too much going on in my brain to be totally focused. My brain is bouncing. It's having a hard time staying concentrating. And so if I realize I'm having a hard time being present, or if I'm present for a couple minutes and then my brain is starting to want to go do something, and it's like, okay, what's going on here? And it's usually, again, I'm back into fight or flight. I don't want to be present in the present. I want to be anywhere but the present is what's going on. And then if I start to see, when Kim would ask me to do something, my first instinct is I want to avoid it. Okay, what's this all about? So any type of avoidance in my brain, how can I get out of this? That's a warning sign. I've had to learn healthy numbing, healthy escapes versus unhealthy numbing dissociation. And so when I'm overwhelmed, I need a healthy numbing escape for a little while. But if I want to stay there all day, what's that all about? That's a warning sign. And so it's just gradually kind of figuring out all of those different pieces that has been important.
It sounds, there's this process of building tools, and then also building awareness, and also having that willingness to be aware of yourself. A little while ago, you mentioned the 12 needs, and they're kind of basic needs, but they're anything but basic.
Yeah, and without realizing it, this really became the foundation of Tim Fletcher Company. It became the foundation of my life. As I look back, my mom was, I think, quite good at meeting all of the 12 needs. But the emphasis in the Christian upbringing was the spiritual need is the most important need, is what matters. And a lot of the other needs were neglected. In the parenting style of most parenting when I was a kid, it was meet the kids' physical needs. You send them to school for their intellectual needs. Their emotional needs don't matter. And you send them to church for their spiritual needs. So there was a kind of a parenting model that really emphasized that the parent's job is to meet the physical needs. Society will take care of the other stuff, kind of. So when I started at this treatment center, the lady that mentored me, that asked me to come there, had worked in the field for 25 years and really was miles ahead of her time at understanding trauma, which wasn't even defined yet. And so she said, Tim, part of hiring you is I want you to prepare a bunch of different brand new workshops for this treatment center. And looking back, there really were all around complex trauma, but again, didn't have the words. And so the very first workshop that I did was on the 12 needs. So it's basically, it was what happens when a children's needs aren't met. How does that affect a child? So that was the basis. Then the second one I did was on shame. The third one I did was on a deeper understanding of anger. The fourth one I did was on codependency issues. So all of those then got pieced into a fuller picture of complex trauma. But when I started working on the 12 needs, basically my mind was, okay, what makes us human? Okay, we got a physical body, yes, but we got a brain, we're relational beings, we got emotions, spiritual component. So I just started exploring what makes us human. And it was just obvious, but not obvious. It was it's been there in front of me all the time, but nobody's talked about it. All of our society is around certain kind of emphasizing certain things. The others are there, but they're not fully acknowledged. And so it was really bringing everything out clearly in the open and saying we're physical, intellectual, emotional, relational, spiritual. We're multifaceted. Each of those 5 areas has their own set of needs. They all need to be, they can only be met if you're in a loving environment that's safe. And so when I began to see that, it was just, wow, to put it all on paper, to begin to understand it was huge for me. And then the first 10, 20 times I taught it to the clients, I'd have people breaking down and crying. And they would go, I had all my physical needs, but not one of those emotional needs was ever met for me. Not one of those relational needs was ever met for me. And I went, wow. And then that started to explain, okay, well, how did you respond when that need wasn't met? I shut down. I got angry. I started to numb. I started to get into addiction. It was like, oh, when you don't meet basic needs, the brain is going to look for a solution. And that just started opening up. So what also came out of that for me was, okay, then what leads to true happiness and contentment? And what I was seeing was, if you don't meet a need, you have a system inside of us that creates a hunger and thirst sensation. I'm discontent. Something's missing. I want that need met. I'm unhappy. And so we cry. We call out for that need to be met. When the need is met, we're content. So what's the solution to contentment? Meet all 12 needs. Now that was significant for me because, again, out of that Christian background, was told, what is the answer to happiness? Meet the spiritual need. But I knew people that were meeting the spiritual need that didn't have their emotional, relational needs met, that were very unhappy. And so, okay, something's wrong with your formula that just meet the spiritual need and everybody's going to be content and happy. And all of a sudden it was like, yeah, we're meant to meet all 12 needs. And once we do, then we experience this peace and happiness we long for.
Yeah, so in a way, it's very holistic.
Exactly.
In meeting this. So when you mentioned kind of the daily maintenance you do earlier, is it this meeting your 12 needs? Is that
Yes.
a big part of your daily maintenance? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, one other piece from childhood, both mom and dad were highly disciplined. So I think that's part of mom living out of her cortex. Doesn't matter what your emotions feel like doing, you're going to do what's healthy. So we had very rigid habits, routines every day. Get up at a certain time, eat healthy, make your bed, do your chores, go to school. Always lots of fun, but there was very disciplined stuff that was there. And Mom, I don't feel like doing it. Too bad. You need to do this. So that self-discipline was built into me, and I became this very self-disciplined teenager. Like I would spend these hours reading. I would forego lots of different things just because I needed to do certain things. So that was built into me. So what I began to realize is the only way to meet my 12 needs consistently is I need a consistent routine that takes care of my 12 needs. So that means habits. That means self-discipline, because there's going to be days I don't feel like it. So I have physical needs. I need to eat well. I need to exercise. I need to get good sleep. Okay? What am I going to do that? Okay. I have kind of that emotional soul that I got to feed. So I need to read because I'm an intellectual person. I got to read stuff that expands my thinking, gets me thinking deeply, that feeds my soul. I love beauty and nature and music, so I need to do those things regularly to feed my soul. But I'd always been such an individualistic person, a loner, that I had to learn, but I also need connection. And I need every day to connect with Kim. I need every day to connect with some key people in my life Otherwise, I won't be healthy. And so it was really gradually learning how to meet all those 12 needs. But that then requires discipline, routine, structure, habits to do it consistently.
Yeah. I see a little piece here tying back to when we talked about love a bit, and it's that, there's this taking of an action, maybe that's different from what our feeling is, and not necessarily falling prey to the feeling, but continuing to take that, I guess, essentially a loving action toward ourselves, for ourselves.
Yeah, and I think, again, it was an important part for me was we had grown up with love your neighbor as yourself as a guideline, but loving yourself was suspicious because that was selfish. That had been abused by a lot of people, and so it was almost taboo to give yourself too much attention. You're pampering yourself, you're being selfish, you weren't being a good Christian. It was more about loving your neighbor and about denying yourself, about putting your needs down. So that's really what came out of that. So again, there was some good stuff, but there was a distortion. It was out of balance. And so when I got sick, what I realized was if I'm ever going to be a good dad again, if I'm ever going to have a healthy life again, I got to learn to take care of me. I can't keep just giving myself away to everybody and not taking care of me, because I'm going to lose my kids. I'm going to lose everything. I got to find the balance between loving others and loving me. And that felt wrong. That felt weird at first. But it was very in my face obvious that there was no way I was ever going to be able to love others again unless I first learned to love myself and to take care of myself and to meet my own needs. And so I had to walk through a time of figuring out that it's okay to love me, what it meant to love me. Loving me wasn't an emotion of feeling good about me all the time. Loving me was an action of taking care of my 12 needs, whether I felt like it or not. And so that was a super important part of the journey, is that there has to be this balance between loving others and loving self.
I think that's kind of your definition of humility as well.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't see ourselves as better than, but there's also not that we're not less than, and then really taking care of ourselves and having that balance.
Yeah, and that, again, kind of came out of... So the emphasis, again, in the Christian culture I grew up in, and this isn't to slam that Christian culture totally, because there were so many good things that came out of that. It's to highlight the things I've seen that were kind of misrepresentations of stuff. But the whole emphasis at that time was, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. So don't have pride. And so parents were very much afraid of giving their kids a big head and making their kids these proud, snobbish, egotistical people. And so the pendulum swung, I think, too far the other way, and it was, well, don't even validate your kids. Don't say positive things about your kids' accomplishments, because they might get a big head and think more highly than they ought. And so sadly, looking back, I never remember my parents praising me for anything. I could tell by the look in their eyes that they were pleased, they were proud of me, but they wouldn't say it, because that would be potentially giving me a big head. And so I had to work through some stuff around that. But what was happening with that was thinking of yourself more lowly was seen as humility, when that's actually shame. And so I got the wrong definition of humility, which means I have to think of myself as worse than everybody, as less than everybody, as lower than everybody. And that when I saw that, no, it says love your neighbor as yourself. It's an equal thing. It's you're just as important as me. It went against that bad teaching, and it forced me to start to really rethink what what is this relationship with myself, relationship with others? And then that led to the right definition of humility, that I'm just as important as you, I matter just as much as you, but that doesn't mean I think I'm better than you. That's what people were afraid would happen if you started to see yourself as just as important as everybody else. So again, that's the inside look behind the curtain at the journey I went through.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a very important journey for me, because what I began to realize is I was always told that humility is the foundation of life, which I believe is true, but I was given the wrong definition of humility. I was actually given shame, which to me destroys so much of life. So when I began to understand the right definition of humility, it was like, now it all makes sense. Yes, that is the foundation of life. Seeing others as just as important as me, but being willing to stand up for me and take care of me. But be teachable, be willing to say I'm wrong, not having to always be right, be better than others. So finding that right balance was so critical in kind of the rest of the work that I do.
Yeah. So you've shared a lot how well the work you've been doing at loving yourself and learning how to love yourself. And I was wondering maybe if you could talk just a little bit. I think you've been doing a really great job at loving your neighbor as well. I discovered you through YouTube videos where you get on stage and you'll talk for an hour, this deep wealth of knowledge about healing and complex trauma. Could you maybe talk a little bit about your starting like the React program and the Finding Freedom?
Yeah, so I think where I'd like to start with this, Andy, is when I started at this treatment center and then that led into complex trauma. If you look back at what I've shared about my early life, this wasn't in my list of goals for my life. This wasn't even on the radar for where I wanted my life. I was seeing myself being this pastor. I was seeing myself in the Christian world. The only thing that was the common piece was I wanted to help people. And so instead of pastoring within a Christian context, I am helping people on this different stage. So when I got into the treatment center and I'm working with clients, because we're working at the underlying issues that resulted in addiction, in the first week that I'm working with clients, so we had a morning workshop and then an afternoon group therapy session and then one-on-one counseling session. So in the first week, I'm listening to these people share at this deep level. And I go, I've spent my life looking for people to share at this level. This is the level that I swim at all the time. And I go, I think I found my home here. I think I finally found people that are getting real and honest and vulnerable and deep enough to talk about what really matters. And I just immediately felt an affinity to these people. And I didn't have their trauma issues, like the severity of their trauma, their addiction, but because of my own complex trauma that I had brought on myself through some bad teaching, I understood their pain. I understood the depths of that deep pain and depression and all of that. So I had that in common with them. So I just was growing immensely myself, working in this environment, teaching this new material that I was coming up and watching it help people put words to their stories, which led to more material. So a couple years in, 2 clients approached me one day and said, "Can we talk to you in your office?" And I said, "Sure." And they said, "Tim, we want you to consider something." They said, "You are wonderful at teaching all of this underlying issue stuff and all the latest research coming out." So again, at that point, complex trauma wasn't even a word. So they're just saying that. Part of being in a treatment center is you are in a treatment center that started under a 12-step approach, but then switched, but was still very much in tune with 12-step. We required clients to go to 2 12-step meetings a week. So I understood the 12-step world. I'd read the big book, taught the steps to people a little bit. And they said, you come out of a Christian world as well. So you got 3 different worlds, that you have this unique ability to bring them together. We would really like you to put this on a public platform and make this available to other people, so it's not just available to clients that come to this treatment center. So in 2007, we started Finding Freedom on Friday nights, where I just started teaching the blend of these three worlds. That took off. And then what was happening as that was taking off is developmental trauma disorder came on the radar as a term. And then Gabor Mate started talking about trauma. And then complex trauma came on the radar. And so I'm starting to learn more and more about this. And then other treatment centers are starting to talk about being trauma informed, and they're beginning to see that there's a connection between addiction and trauma, and everybody's talking about trauma. And so I got asked one day to go to a meeting where the directors of different treatment centers were meeting to kind of talk about their direction. And so I just asked, I said, all of you guys are talking about trauma. All of you guys are saying this is so important in understanding addiction, and most treatment centers at that point were only experiencing less than 10% success rate with clients staying clean and sober. And you're saying we got to deal with the trauma to really help people and increase our success rate. I said, how many of you are willing to change your programs and actually deal with trauma? Not one was willing to change. I just couldn't believe it. I go, you're all talking about it. You're all seeing the importance of it, but nobody's going to change your program. No, we can't because of funding. We can't because we've always done it this way. We lose support. So I went away very frustrated. And at that point, I go, I'm not interested in starting a treatment center. That's not my gift set. That I'm just a teacher, a counselor. But I spent 3 years just kind of pondering what would a program look like that actually dealt with trauma and addiction together and really helped. But I was partly waiting for another treatment center to change their program, and it wasn't happening. It was obvious it wasn't going to happen. And so in 2016, we got a source of funding that would enable us to start a treatment program. So we started React we're going to give this a go. It just exploded. We saw it was working. The success rate was over 50%. And it was like, wow, when you start dealing with the trauma, you see different results, way better results. And then word started getting out, and I started getting requests for me to explain what we were doing because they were very interested. And then different treatment centers wanted to use our material. Others wanted to start a parallel treatment center. And so that's how React started. But it was a very kind of gradual thing, and it was really because nobody else was willing to do it. And somebody had to do it. I didn't think I was the right guy for it, but it had to be done.
And then was it due to COVID then that you went online? Because there's a lot of education and lessons online at this point.
Yeah. So COVID hit. We had to shut down the treatment center. But the clients are going, well, we still want to meet. So we said, okay, let's put it all online. So we quickly put everything online, did Zoom every day with clients. And somehow the word got out that we were doing stuff online. And we started getting requests. Could I take your program online? Well, this is just for the people in Winnipeg. But it was, okay, we're getting so many requests. Well, why don't we start an online program? So we started Lift. And it just exploded. So now we have people from over 30 countries in the world that are taking it, over 200 people taking it. So it's kind of one of the hidden blessings that came out of COVID is it forced us to put stuff online, and that just led to this kind of worldwide thing.
Yeah, it seems like there was a fortuitous timing there with, your history and then COVID and so much moving to this online world. I was wondering, you've touched so many people's lives, both on a one-on-one as a counselor, and then thousands of people in person and at seminars, and I think in the online world through YouTube and social media. It's probably at millions at this point. What is a piece of advice that you would give to somebody who's just beginning their own healing journey?
I think there's still a shame element in our society around working on yourself and growing. It's almost like, I'm strong, I don't need to work on myself, I don't have any problems, I don't need to look at myself. And it's like, that's shame, that's not humility, that's not strength. There's no shame in wanting to grow. There's no shame in being open to change and to look at yourself and to, so that's part one. Part two is there's still an element of culture that says if I look honestly at my parents, I'm being disloyal to my parents. I'm dishonoring my parents. And I go, no, you're not. You're just being honest. You're getting out of denial. You're seeing how all of that influenced you. Much of what they did was not intentional. It's not they were trying to be bad parents. They were trying to be wonderful parents, but stuff happened within their culture, within their upbringings that then affected you. You're just trying to understand that so you can get healthy and don't pass it on to your kids. You're not trying to paint them as terrible. So it's really getting past those two mindsets that to me is so important, because those keep so many people from actually ever getting help. Because they're afraid everybody's going to think what's wrong with you? You're going to a counselor? You're taking a program? Like, there's just a shame message that comes that this keeps them from doing that. And so it's just to realize that's a sick culture telling you stuff from their own sickness. Healthy people want to keep growing, want to keep understanding parts of them that aren't healthy so they can change them. That's what healthy is all about. It's constant growth, change, self-evaluation, self-exploration. That's a wonderful thing. And once you begin to do it and see the benefits of it, you go, why was I kind of restricted by those two mindsets? But they're very powerful. So if people can just give themselves permission to grow, to self-examine, to examine the dynamics of their upbringing, that would be a wonderful starting point.
Yeah, it's like shame and blame are kind of
Exactly.
so deeply threaded into the culture that it's hard to really look at the truth and be authentic.
Exactly.
Until you start to look between those. Yeah. Well, let me ask you one other question. Like, so at the point where you are today, if you could go back to your younger self at any point in your life, and just tell yourself something, give yourself a tool or a hint or an idea, what would that be?
I don't know that there's one particular thing, but there's definitely one that I would say is an important one to pass on. My mom was actually very compassionate to me, but because of that unrealistic standard and kind of Christian judgmental mindset, I became very hard on myself. I became beat yourself up. God's mad at you because you did this. People are going to judge you, so you got to punish yourself, put yourself in jail, pay your time before you can be free. So it was that very strong internal critic, that thinking that the way to motivate healthy change is to be hard on yourself and beat yourself up. So it took self-discipline to cruelty, abusive torture almost. And so such an important piece for me was realizing self-compassion. And I just, looking back, wish that little Tim had somebody that just came alongside regularly and said, Tim, you're okay. Tim, you're doing well. Tim, I'm proud of you. And gave that validation, affirmation, compassion in a very felt way. I think that would have saved me lots of years of self-recrimination.
Well, I'll say right now, Tim, you're doing really well. There's so many of us who are so proud of you, and we all think you're okay. And I wanna thank you, just so much for sharing your story with us today. It's been a really powerful and a really insightful conversation. And I'm personally grateful for the time that we've spent together, and I really hope that others get some value out of this. So thanks for coming here today and talking with us.
Thank you for being a great host, Andy.
Thank you for joining us on the Time with Tim podcast. If you'd like to share your own experiences or have questions, feel free to email us at podcasts@timfletcher.ca. Want to learn more about complex trauma? Subscribe to Tim Fletcher's YouTube channel for past lectures and his Friday night Tim Talks. You can also connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and TikTok. Looking for more support? We offer programs and courses to help with healing complex trauma and recovering from addictions. Visit timfletcher.ca to learn more or send us an inquiry. We're here to support you. Until we meet again, take care, and thank you for letting us be a part of your healing journey.